Today we're talking about 12 mistakes that make your book look amateurish. And look, I don't mention these as a way to drag authors down, right? I think if you find these in your manuscript, it just gives you the opportunity to be able to revise them and to improve your book before it reaches the readers. But let's get right into it and start with number 1, scene transitions where characters wake or go to sleep. So you've probably heard not to start your book with like an alarm clock or characters waking up, but I think this actually holds true for every scene in your book. Usually it's a boring place to start a scene with someone waking up. I mean, unless there's something unusual about them waking up, like they're waking up transformed into a giant cockroach, you probably don't want to start there. What you should do is just skip ahead to the good stuff. When does the scene actually start? When does the action actually start? When does the conflict actually start? But a lot of writers forget that it's just as boring to stop a scene, whether it's at the end of a chapter or just at the end of a section, with your character going to sleep. There's no tension there. There's not really any reason that you're giving the reader some sort of motivation to keep reading on to the next scene or the next chapter. Now, if you're only doing this really occasionally, I mean, it's not the worst thing. I would just squint at it extra hard and be like, is this the right place to start a scene or in my scene? A second mistake that makes your book look a little amateurish is character names being too similar. So I have 3 main mistakes to avoid in this category. The first one is just in terms of alliteration. If all your names start with the same letter, Mike, Matt, Mark, it just confuses the reader and it makes it harder for them to keep all these characters separate and just enjoy your story. In general, it's fine to make readers work a little bit, but if you can use a few techniques to make it easier on the reader to just understand and comprehend your story, it's usually a good idea to use those techniques. A second mistake people make with character names is making all their character names the exact same length. Take a look at Brandon, Christy, and Douglas. All 7 letters. So visually, as the reader comes across those names in the novel, there's not an immediate visual sense of what makes that name different. I know some of you are like, well, there's different letters in them. Okay, I get that, but when a reader's reading quickly and scanning over a text, sometimes 2 names can look alike if they're all the same length. It's just one extra little bit of visual work the reader has to do to distinguish between people and remember, oh yeah, that person is that person and that person is that person. Compare that to something like Ed and Sebastian, right? Sebastian is 9 letters long. Just visually, it's so easy to keep him separate from a name like Ed. Now, this third mistake is honestly the trickiest one, but it's also the one I see most often. This happens so often in books where all the characters have the same vowels in their name. So I'll read a book where there's like Natasha, Amanda, and Dan. I'm like, why all A's? Once again, it's a very, very, very small thing, but it makes it just a teensy bit harder for the reader to remember who is who when everyone has the exact same vowels. Another one that I see really frequently is they have 2 vowels, but they're always in the same order. For example, like Blake, Rachel, and James, they all start with the letter A and then move on to the letter E. Once again, some of you think I'm crazy right now, but I'm okay with that. The general principle is you're trying to make dissimilar names. So take all 3 of these things into account and ask yourself, are my character names dissimilar enough? If you can answer yes to that question, wonderful. Push forward. But otherwise, just consider how you can differentiate names more from each other. The third mistake that can make your book look amateurish is repetitive sentence structures. For example, starting multiple sentences in a row, all with the same thing. He did this, he did that, he went there. Or if you're writing in the first person, starting every single sentence with I. I loved it. I went to the store and bought every color. I couldn't help but think I had scored. Folks, this is SVO, subject, verb, object. Say it with me, SVO. So your goal is just to create a lot of different types of sentences because when you put those all together, it's not gonna seem redundant or repetitive. It's gonna create a kind of music. So start with something like a dependent clause and it will help vary up your sentence structure. Even though I liked her, comma, I could never date her. Yes, I know I'm harping on repetition as a bad thing in this section of the video, but if you do want to see some great examples of repetition, I have a post for you. Check out my post on the 17 fantastic examples of repetition in literature. I will put a link to it in the description. The fourth thing that can mark your book as a little amateurish is, as you know, Bob, dialogue. As you know, Bob dialogue is basically where characters are talking to the reader rather than talking to each other. And it got named this because characters would say things like, as you already know, Bob, let me tell you a bunch of stuff you already know, because I'm not really talking to you, I am talking to the reader. And here's an example. As you know, Bob, ever since Mom and Dad died in that tragic car crash 5 years ago, leaving you to raise me as a teenager, I've struggled with trusting people. That's why I became a detective, to solve mysteries like their unsolved hit and run. What I want you to think about is realism. What would this character in this particular time and place actually say to their brother? Because I guarantee you they would not say that. So let's look at 2 ways we can rewrite that as you know Bob dialogue. One is simply talking about photos of a new case that she's handling, and those photos are reminding her of when her parents died. So you get in the backstory, but you do it in a very organic way because she is looking at an object and it gives her a memory of a previous event. And a second strategy is just to have dialogue that seems a little more real. Check out this example. Bob says, "Take yourself off the Henderson hit and run." Sarah says, "You're my brother, not my captain." He says, "I'm both. And you've spent 5 years trying to solve every hit and run that crosses your desk. Since mom and dad." And I like that little ellipses there. Like, he doesn't actually have to say it, and yet the reader can infer, oh, like, okay, since there was a tragedy with mom and dad. I get it. And then she says back, "And you've spent 5 years trying to protect me." So we have conflict, right? It's not just information. So the problem with the "as you know Bob" dialogue is it's just information. With dialogue like this, we get a little sparring, we get a little conflict, and that makes the scene a little more lively. A fifth thing that makes your book seem a little more amateurish is constantly using greetings. If every time 2 characters meet in your book, they exchange pleasantries, you know, like the way we do in real life, it gets very boring very quickly. You do not want your characters to say hello. You do not want them to say goodbye. You do not want them to say like, "Hey, how you doing?" Yes, you want to do this in real life, or people will think you're like a weird psychopath, but on the page, it just doesn't work. Take a look at this example. "Hi, how are you?" Sonia said as she walked into the office. "Good, thanks. How are you?" Amir replied. "Fine, thanks. Listen, about the Anderson case." How do we revise that? Skip to the good stuff. Sonia burst into the office, clutching the Anderson file. The fingerprints came back. You're not going to believe this. So do away with all that throat clearing stuff and get to the heart of the scene. The sixth thing that can make your book feel a little amateurish is using italics for character thoughts. Now, 40, 50 years ago, this used to be a very popular stylistic choice to help differentiate between what the narrator is saying and what the character is actually thinking. But over time, as less people write in omniscient voice and more people write in close third, everything that is on the page is kind of what the character is thinking. Everything is already being filtered through the character's consciousness. So you don't need to mark out something as like, these are the actual words that this character is thinking, because everything that's being described is kind of what the character is thinking. Now, there are some corners in certain genres where this technique has persisted, but I would say in general, it's a style that has fallen out of favor, and it would probably be better if you found a different way to show that these are the character thoughts rather than italicizing them. The seventh mistake that you should definitely avoid is introducing too many characters in the first chapter. I see so many writers where they've been thinking about this book for so long and they have all of these characters in their head, and so they throw all of that on the page in the first chapter, and the reader's just staggered, right? They're like, I can't get an access point. What is going on? There's like 19 different characters. Your main enemy as a writer is confusion. I'll say it again. Your main enemy is confusion. Confused readers do not continue reading. Confused readers do not recommend that book to other people. Don't confuse your reader. So I have 5 very quick points to help you avoid having too many characters in your opening chapter. 1, start with 2 or 3 very central core characters and then slowly layer in other characters in relationship to those 2 or 3 characters. Like a coworker or a son comes along who is related to one of those 2 to 3 main characters. 2, give characters a really distinctive trait or characteristic that helps mark them in the reader's mind so they can figure out who is who. And it doesn't have to be super complex. It could be a redhead. There could be someone with a scar in their face. There could be someone who's very tall. There could be someone with a particular job. 3, you want to reinforce names in the first chapter a little more frequently than you will later on in the book. Also, you want to use character names slightly more frequently than you do in the rest of your book, because they're just getting to know the characters and just learning their names in the first chapter. Sometimes that means using the actual name rather than using the dialogue tag of he said. 4, create clear relationships between characters. For instance, his skeptical older sister, or the shop owner who always feuded with his father. And yes, in case you're wondering, this is telling, this is not showing. And in the beginning of your book, sometimes it requires a little bit of telling just to get the reader on board with what's happening. It's completely fine to tell in a situation like that. And then 5, don't give names to unimportant characters. If this character doesn't have a role to play in future chapters, don't name them because you're confusing the reader. You're telling them, this is someone to pay attention to, and then they really shouldn't have paid attention to that person. They should have paid attention to the named characters, your main characters. So names are like signposts telling the reader what really to pay attention to. The 8th thing to avoid in your book is transparent author moves. So this is a big umbrella category that basically describes any time that the reader isn't concentrating on the book, but they're seeing through the book and they're noticing like, oh, here's the author doing something. They're more aware of you being a writer rather than just being immersed in the world of your book. And I'm just gonna give you one example of this, but I think you'll instantly know what I mean. When characters look in a mirror in order to describe themselves, you're thinking, okay, that's very convenient for you, author, to have a first-person narrator be able to take some time to describe themselves. The trouble is, the reader is not really seeing the character in that moment. They are seeing an author as a puppeteer, playing with all of these little puppets and making them dance, which takes them out of the world of the novel. A 9th thing that makes your book seem a little bit amateurish is introducing items or skills just before they're needed. For instance, 1 minute before the team needs someone with telepathic abilities, lo and behold, we learn someone on the team has telepathic abilities. No. Drop that 50 pages earlier, and then by the time we reach that point in the novel, we'll believe that they have telepathic abilities rather than like the author put it in there to solve a plot problem. For instance, if your character is going to need to pick locks in the latter part of your novel, then have part of their backstory be that they apprenticed with a locksmith, or have them have a hobby of like picking with locks and show them doing that throughout the novel. But I will say, don't make this a transparent author move. Sometimes there's little events that happen in the story and you're like, I see what you're doing there, author. You're just setting stuff up. So as much as possible, the skill or item should be integrated into your storyline to make it seem organic and natural to the story that you're telling. And my last tip for this is to make sure you're creating multiple touch points throughout the book. Instead of one heavy-handed introduction of that item or skill, create just little touch points throughout the book that make it seem more natural and a little more subtle as well. The 10th thing you want to avoid is having characters talk to themselves. Having characters sort of narrate their actions out loud. Oh, now I'm just going to put this key in my pocket. It's always a little strange, right? Unless they are an actual type of person who does speak out loud to themselves all the time, you probably don't want that in your book. Now, what can you do instead? You can use body language and gestures and movement and action to show what they're actually doing. And obviously you can use dialogue with others. Make someone else be in the scene if at all possible. And then lastly, it's usually a good idea just to have the character think things in their brain rather than actually saying it out loud. And the 11th thing, which you probably want to avoid at all costs, is breaking from reality. Do your characters never need to eat or to use the bathroom? Does not a single one of your characters ever have jobs or concerns about money, and yet they live pretty lavish lifestyles? Or is absolutely everyone in your book just exceptionally good looking? Like Zoolander, really good looking. A little sidebar here, you really notice the exceptionally beautiful one in like B-level television shows where for no reason at all, every single person on the cast is like crazily model beautiful. And you're like, come on, these random people who got stranded in the woods and they're all drop dead gorgeous. Please. This sort of thing can make readers roll their eyes, and it can make it seem like a fantasy, and not in the good sense of like a genre fantasy, but like a crazy fantasy that they don't believe. Look, in general, you should strive for plausibility in your book. It doesn't mean you have to explicitly name every single time the characters need to take a poop or a pee, but it does mean you attend to certain realities of lived existence and make it seem as though they live in this world. Now, the 12th and final mistake that can mark your book as being a little amateurish is a little controversial, but hang on there, I'm gonna explain myself. It is writing in present tense. I know I'm gonna get hate for this in the comments, but hear me out, hear my justification. I am not saying that writing in present tense is bad. There are plenty of amazing books written in present tense. I personally have nothing against present tense, but if you look at the spectrum of authors who use present tense, there is a much higher ratio of authors at the beginning of their journey that use present tense than very established or longtime authors. It's merely a statistical observation. And I know many of you out there, maybe you prefer reading present tense. Once again, like nothing wrong with that. Like that's great. I think there are lots of benefits to writing in the present tense, but you have to take into account that it is a tense that beginning writers tend to favor. So So it can mark your manuscript as being like, oh, I have a feeling this is written by someone who's just starting off as a writer because it's written in present tense. Now, but if you can write fantastic sentences, the reader's going to be like, no, I believe this author's been around for a while. Like, I believe these sentences. This does not seem like a beginner. So I don't mean to dissuade you from using the present tense if it is the right tense for your story. You have to have a reason or a justification for using present tense. If you don't know why you're using it, that's a good sign. You should probably just write the story in past tense. And also, I'm not saying if you have a story that's flipping between like a present tense moment and a past tense moment and you're using tenses to distinguish between those two things, perfectly fine, nothing wrong with that. I'm only talking about stories which are completely present tense. That said, most of the time you can write past tense for both the present moment story and the past story, and it will work perfectly fine. Okay, rant over. You can disagree with me in the comments. I'm cool with it. I'm fine with it. But just wanted to weigh in and give my 2 cents there. I hope that helped you avoid making some mistakes in your book and also gave you some stuff to revise later on when you're in the revision process. Happy writing.